If you enjoy these deep dives into historical narratives, please consider subscribing for more stories like this. In the autumn of 1971, Bonn, the provisional capital of the Federal Republic of Germany, felt more like a damp, quiet university town than the center of the West's ideological struggle. It was a city of gray skies, heavy Rhine River fog, and bureaucratic patience. Within the concrete and glass compound of the American Embassy, Arthur Vance served as an assistant cultural attaché. He was 46 years old, with a thinning hairline, a preference for wool ties, and a quiet demeanor that suited his cover. He organized jazz concerts and academic exchanges, spoke fluent if slightly stiff German, and lived with his wife Helen in a comfortable suburban house in Bad Godesberg. Vance was, by all appearances, a mid-level diplomat, unremarkable and perfectly forgettable. This assessment was, by design, inaccurate. Vance was a station officer for the Central Intelligence Agency, Directorate of Operations. His true work involved the management of assets, the sterile transfer of information, and the patient, granular analysis of the East German temperament. He was a professional, trained to observe, not to participate, and his greatest asset was his own perceived blandness. Across the border, deep inside the German Democratic Republic, the city of Berlin remained the focal point of the entire global conflict. In the Karlshorst district of East Berlin, surrounded by high walls and barbed wire, stood the headquarters of the Soviet KGB's First Chief Directorate. Inside a small, heated office, Major Viktor Orlov reviewed a file. Orlov was the antithesis of Vance. He was stout, perpetually smelling of strong tobacco, and possessed a mind that saw conspiracy in coincidence and patterns in chaos. He was a product of the Committee for State Security, a believer in the system, and a deeply patient hunter. The file on his desk was thin, codenamed Akademiker, the academic. It detailed the comings and goings of Arthur Vance. For months, Vance's file had been routine, filled with transcripts of his banal telephone calls about booking lecture halls. But in the last 3 weeks, a new element had been introduced. A low-level German clerk working in the embassy's administrative office, an asset cultivated for years by the GDR's Ministry for State Security, MFS, or Stasi, had reported a change in Vance's routine. The clerk, codenamed Kestrel, was not high-level, but he was observant. He noted that Akademiker had begun making unusual requests for travel documentation, specifically for the Interzonenzug, the interzonal train that ran from West Germany through the GDR to West Berlin. To Orlov, this was a deviation. Diplomats and intelligence officers preferred to fly. The air corridor from Frankfurt to Berlin was fast, secure, and above GDR jurisdiction. A train, conversely, was slow. It was terrestrial. And most importantly, for its entire transit through the GDR, it was sovereign East German territory. Why would a cautious man like Vance subject himself to that? Orlov read the latest intercept, a request from Vance for a compartment on the D240 train, traveling from Cologne to Berlin's Bahnhof Zoo in 2 days' time. He lit another cigarette, the acrid smoke filling the small room. He picked up the secure telephone that connected him directly to the Stasi headquarters in Normanenstrasse. "It is time," he told the duty officer, "to activate the observation plan for Akademiker. He is moving." The decision to take the train had not been Arthur Vance's preference. It was a necessity dictated by his primary asset in East Berlin, a high-level functionary in the GDR's economic ministry, codenamed Fulcrum. Fulcrum was terrified. He had reported a sudden internal audit within his ministry, a data purification process that was, in reality, a Stasi counterintelligence sweep. He refused to use the usual dead drop locations. He refused the encrypted one-time pad signals. He would only hand over the new 5-year economic projections, which detailed critical resource dependencies on the Soviet Union, in person. And he would not meet in East Berlin. The new protocol was risky, devised by a panicked man. Fulcrum would use a relative's visitation permit to travel to West Berlin. He would meet Vance at a prearranged, safe location, a quiet cafe near the Savignyplatz. This meant Vance had to get to West Berlin, receive the package, and carry it back. Flying was too fast. The transfer would be too obvious. The train, Fulcrum's handlers at Langley argued, was the better cover. It was slow, anonymous, and filled with civilians. Vance could board in Cologne, travel overnight, conduct the meeting, and return. It was a classic in-and-out operation, complicated by the fact that the entry and exit points were surrounded by hostile territory. Vance's preparations showed the first signs of stress. His tradecraft, usually impeccable, developed small fissures. He booked the train ticket himself using a personal credit card, not through the embassy travel pool, believing it would create less of a bureaucratic trail. This was a mistake. The Stasi's HVA, Foreign Intelligence Division, which ran Kestrel, cross-referenced all travel data of embassy personnel. The private booking, intended as stealth, was instead a bright red flag. In Karlshorst, Major Orlov reviewed the data. He books it himself, Orlov explained to his new Stasi liaison, Hauptmann Jürgen Kleist. Kleist was young, ambitious, and represented the new, educated generation of MFS officers. He saw the Stasi not just as a shield, but as a sword. He uses a private card. This tells us two things, Orlov continued, tapping the file. 1. His own agency does not officially sanction this trip. It is off the books, which means it is important. 2. He is carrying, not communicating. He is the mule. Kleist nodded, understanding the implication. The train, Major? It is a cage. Exactly, Hauptmann. A cage moving through our territory. Vance, meanwhile, argued with his wife, Helen. It was a small domestic disagreement, born of his secrecy and her intuition. Why the train, Arthur? It takes 8 hours. Just fly. I want to see the countryside, he lied, packing his small leather briefcase. The autumn colors. Helen did not believe him. She had lived with the silences for 15 years. The quiet tension in his shoulders, the way he double-checked the locks on his briefcase. These were signs she had learned to read as warnings. The last time you wanted to see the countryside was in '68, right before the Prague nonsense. Just be careful. He kissed her goodbye, the briefcase feeling heavier than it should. He drove his Opel to the Bonn station, then took a connector train to Cologne. He felt a profound sense of foreboding. He felt watched. In the bustling Cologne Hauptbahnhof, amidst the West German commuters, businessmen, and families, he scanned the crowd. He saw no one, no familiar face, no obvious surveillance. But the feeling persisted. It was the professional paranoia that kept men in his line of work functioning. He boarded the Interzonenzug D240 and found his private compartment. The train gave a lurch and began its slow journey east, toward the iron heart of the divide. The discovery for the KGB did not happen on the train. It occurred 24 hours earlier, in the sterile, fluorescent-lit offices of the Stasi's Signals Intelligence Division. Kestrel, the embassy clerk, had done his job. He had provided the when, the D240 train, and the how, a private booking. But this was not enough for Major Orlov. He needed the why. A diplomatic attaché taking a train was unusual, but not yet an act of espionage. Orlov needed justification to intercept a man with a diplomatic passport. The justification came from Abteilung 3, the Stasi's radio monitoring division, which worked in close coordination with the Soviet GRU. For months they had been monitoring a specific low-wattage transmission from an apartment in East Berlin. They knew it belonged to Fulcrum, but they had been patient, letting him operate, hoping he would lead them to his handler. The night before Vance's departure, Fulcrum, in his panic, made a fatal error. He used an emergency burst transmission to send a 2-word message to a listening post in West Berlin. In transit. The intercept was immediate. It was correlated with Kestrel's report. The Stasi and KGB analysts in Karlshorst worked through the night. The equation was simple. Academiker, Vance, moves on the D240. Fulcrum, the asset, sends an emergency signal indicating a package is in transit. He is not going to receive, Orlov stated, slapping the intercept report on his desk. He is going to deliver. Or, no. He paused, his mind reevaluating the data. Wait, Fulcrum is in East Berlin. Vance is in Bonn. Fulcrum cannot get to Bonn. Vance can get to West Berlin. Fulcrum has a relative. Yes. Orlov pulled Fulcrum's family file. A cousin in wedding. He has a valid visitation permit. Fulcrum will meet Vance in West Berlin. This changed everything. Vance was not the mule. He was the recipient. He would be traveling back from Berlin with the package. Orloff looked at Hauptmann Kleist. He will be clean on the way to Berlin, but he will be carrying state secrets on the way back. Kleist saw the problem. We cannot stop him on the return trip, the Interzonenzug from Berlin to the west. The checks at Marienborn are for people entering the GDR, not leaving it. The Allies monitor the return transit closely. It would be a diplomatic incident of the highest order. Orloff smiled, a thin, cold expression. You are thinking like a German, Hauptmann. Too logical. You are correct. We cannot stop him on the return. So we will force him to carry the package on the way there. Kleist was confused. But Fulcrum has the package in Berlin. Does he? Orloff said. Vance is an experienced officer. Fulcrum is a panicked amateur. Would Vance risk traveling all that way for a meeting that might not happen? Or would he bring something to give Fulcrum to calm him down? Money, new codes, escape documents? This was the ambiguity Orloff needed. The mere possibility that Vance was carrying compromising materials into Berlin was enough. The intelligence from Fulcrum, the in-transit signal, was misinterpreted, or, more accurately, deliberately reinterpreted by Orloff. He presented his justification to his superiors. Akademiker is using the cover of a routine trip to transfer operational funds and materials to a known high-level asset. The risk is too great. He must be intercepted during the transit. The operational plan was simple. Hauptmann Kleist would lead a shadow team. They would board the D-240 at various stops before the border. The interception itself would take place on the long, dark stretch of track between the border crossing at Marienborn and the first major stop at Potsdam. They would use a gray pretext, a customs inspection, a passport irregularity. They would not, Kleist was instructed, breach diplomatic protocol unless they found something. You will find something, Hauptmann, Orloff assured him. Men like Vance always have something to hide. A codebook, a list of contacts, even a large amount of undeclared Western currency is enough. Find the pretext. The train is our laboratory, and Herr Vance is the specimen. The order was given. The hunt was now active. The Interzonenzug D-240 was a microcosm of the Cold War. In its compartment sat West German businessmen heading for trade fairs, elderly women going to visit relatives in West Berlin, a few young backpackers, and a scattering of Allied military personnel in civilian clothes. And, as of the stop in Hanover, it also carried Hauptmann Jürgen Kleist and his three-man team from the Stasi's Abteilung II, counterintelligence. Kleist and his men were invisible. They did not wear the ill-fitting suits of Stasi field agents. They were dressed as typical passengers. One man sat in the dining car, nursing a beer and reading a newspaper. Another was 2 cars down from Vance, pretending to sleep. Kleist himself was in the next car, in a compartment identical to Vance's. They were professionals, trained in the art of passive observation. Arthur Vance, in his private compartment, felt the atmosphere change as the train neared the GDR border. The chatter in the corridor quieted. The mood grew somber, as if the train itself was holding its breath. He looked out the window at the passing West German countryside, the tidy farms and brightly lit towns, knowing they would soon be replaced. At Helmstedt, the last stop in the west, the train emptied of local commuters, leaving only those making the full transit. Then it slowly rolled across the border. The crossing at Marienborn was a masterpiece of intimidation. The train stopped under massive glaring floodlights. Barbed wire fences stretched into the darkness on either side. GDR Grenztruppen, border troops, with their distinctive helmets and short automatic weapons, boarded the train. This was the first check. A stern-faced border guard, accompanied by a plainclothes Stasi officer, knocked on Vance's compartment door. Ihre Papier, bitte. Your papers, please. Vance handed over his blue diplomatic passport. The guard examined it, his face impassive. He checked the photo, then the visa. The Stasi officer in the back simply watched Vance. He noted the man's hands, steady. He noted his eyes, calm. He noted the briefcase on the luggage rack. The guard handed the passport back. Danke. He moved on. For Vance, this was the first hurdle passed. He was, as Orloff had predicted, clean. His briefcase contained only a change of clothes, a shaving kit, a copy of The Quiet American, and his travel itinerary. He had no codebooks, no lists, no large sums of money. The operational funds for Fulcrum were being handled by the Berlin station, not by him. He was simply the courier for the return trip. He allowed himself a small internal sigh of relief, but the surveillance had only just begun. From his compartment, Hauptmann Kleist received the report from the border officer. He is clean. Passport is in order. No reaction to pressure. Kleist was unfazed. As expected, now we begin phase 2. The train began to move again, clattering slowly through the dark, fortified death strip and into the GDR proper. The next major stop was Potsdam, hours away. This was the window. Vance tried to read his book, but the tension remained. A conductor came by to check his ticket. Vance noted, with a flicker of professional interest, that this conductor was new. The West German conductors had disembarked at Helmstedt, replaced by their East German counterparts. This one was young, with sharp eyes that lingered just a fraction of a second too long. Half an hour later, a different man, portly and dressed in the uniform of the Reichsbahn, GDR Railway, knocked and asked to see his ticket again. New regulations, the man mumbled, punching the ticket a second time. Vax knew this was false. This was harassment. This was the system testing him. He remained polite, compliant. "Of course. Is there a problem?" "No problem," the man said, and left. In the dining car, Vance ordered a coffee. The car was mostly empty. The waiter was slow, almost sullen. At a table across the aisle, a man who had been there since Hanover, Kleist's man, was still reading the same section of his Neues Deutschland newspaper. Vance felt the invisible net tightening. They were not just watching him, they were managing him, controlling his environment, trying to provoke a mistake, a nervous tick, a reason to escalate. He paid for his coffee and returned to the isolation of his compartment, locking the door behind him. He looked at his briefcase, then out at the dark, indistinguishable East German forest rushing past the window. The train was now deep in hostile territory. The train was somewhere between Magdeburg and Brandenburg, a long, dark stretch of railway punctuated by small, unlit signal towers. This was the moment Kleist had chosen. The civilian passengers were asleep or reading. The corridors were empty. The rhythm of the wheels provided a monotonous, hypnotic soundtrack. The knock on Vance's door was not the polite tap of a conductor. It was a firm, official rap. Vance, who had been dozing, sat up, his senses instantly alert. "Herr Vance, this is the transport police. Please open the door." The German was precise, bureaucratic. Vance unlocked the door. Standing outside were two men in the dark green uniforms of the Transportpolizei, VOPO. Behind them, slightly to the side, was the portly man who had checked his ticket earlier, the Reichsbahn official. This man, Vance now understood, was the one in charge. It was Hauptmann Kleist, shedding his cover. "Is there a problem, officers?" Vance kept his voice level. "We have a report," Kleist said, stepping forward. He did not identify himself as Stasi. He was simply an inspector. "A report of undeclared goods being transported on this train. We are conducting a customs check of this carriage." "I am traveling on a diplomatic passport," Vance stated, reaching for his jacket. "We are aware, Herr Vance," Kleist said with a dismissive wave. "Your person and your diplomatic pouch are inviolable. This is understood. However, your personal luggage is subject to GDR customs regulations while on GDR territory. This is a simple formality." The lie was smooth, practiced. Diplomatic luggage was, by convention, also respected, but Kleist was operating in the gray area of legal ambiguity. The two VOPO officers stepped into the compartment, filling the small space. They were large men, and their presence was a form of nonverbal pressure. "Please, your luggage," Kleist said, pointing to the overhead rack. Vance knew he had two options. He could protest, escalating the situation, causing a diplomatic incident, and forcing them to physically restrain him. Or he could comply, assuming his currently clean status would diffuse the situation. He chose compliance. A protest would be seen as an admission of guilt. He lifted down his garment bag and his briefcase. He placed them on the small, empty seat. "Please open the garment bag." Vance unzipped it. One of the VOPO officers, with surprising gentleness, ran his hands through the two suits, the shirts, and the pairs of socks. He found nothing. "And the shaving kit?" Vance handed it over. The officer opened it, inspecting the razor, the shaving cream, the toothbrush. He unscrewed the cap of the aftershave and sniffed it. He handed it back to Kleist. "Now, the briefcase, please," Kleist said. This was the centerpiece. This was the object of their interest. Vance felt a cold knot in his stomach, even knowing it was clean. He undid the two brass latches and opened it. Inside were his files of sheet music for the cultural exchange, his copy of The Quiet American, and a folder of embassy correspondence. Kleist picked up the book. He fanned the pages. He checked the spine, bending it, feeling for any thickness that might suggest a hidden hollow. He found nothing. He set it down. He moved to the files. He scanned the sheet music. "You are a musician, Herr Vance?" "I organize events for musicians," Vance replied, his voice tight. Kleist looked at the correspondence. It was all routine, unclassified. He set it aside. The briefcase was now empty, except for its silk lining. Kleist ran his fingers along the seams, pressing the bottom. He knocked on it with his knuckle. It sounded solid. Kleist frowned. He had expected something, a microdot, a code, a false bottom. Orlov had been convinced. "It seems your paperwork is in order," Kleist said, his voice flat with disappointment. He was preparing to leave, to report failure to Orlov. One of the VOPO officers, the one who had been silent, was still looking at the briefcase. He pointed. "Hauptmann, the lining. It's new." Kleist looked again. The VOPO was right. The silk lining was a slightly different color at the edges, the stitching tighter than factory work. It was an expert job, but not a perfect one. Kleist looked at Vance. Vance's face was pale. He had not known about the briefcase. It had been supplied to him by the Berlin station's technical services. He had been told it was standard. He now realized with dawning horror that he had been set up, not by his own side, but by the object itself. The briefcase was designed for a false bottom, but he hadn't been given the insert. The compartment was empty, but its existence was the crime. "Please, Herr Vance," Kleist said, his voice now dangerously quiet. "Show me how this opens." Vance's mind raced. He could deny it, but the VOPO officer was already probing the seam with a small pocket knife. To deny it would be pointless. "It's just a briefcase," Vance said, his voice weak. The VOPO officer found the catch. It was a magnetic clasp hidden beneath the leather trim. He depressed it. With a soft, oiled snick, the false bottom released. Kleist lifted the panel. Beneath it was a shallow compartment, perfectly sized for documents, microfilm, or cash. It was completely, totally empty. Kleist stared at the empty space. Then he looked at Vance. The confrontation was complete. Vance had no compromising materials, but he had possession of a piece of espionage equipment. On sovereign GDR territory, this was more than enough. "Arthur Vance," Kleist said, his voice now formal and hard, "you are in violation of Article 97 of the Criminal Code of the German Democratic Republic. You are carrying tools for the purpose of espionage." "I have diplomatic immunity," Vance whispered, the words sounding hollow. "Your immunity is a matter for the diplomats to discuss," Kleist replied. "My duty is to state security. The train will be making an unscheduled stop. You will come with us." The Interzonenzug D240 did not have a diplomatic incident lever. It had an emergency brake, and the VOPO officer pulled it. The train shuddered, the scream of metal on metal echoing through the dark carriages, waking the other passengers. Outside, in the blackness of the Brandenburg forest, the train ground to a halt. For Arthur Vance, the world had compressed to the small, claustrophobic compartment. The discovery of the empty compartment was, in its own way, more devastating than if it had been full. A full compartment would have been a straightforward operational failure. An empty one was a personal, professional catastrophe. He had been caught not for what he did, but for what he was. A spy, identified by his tools, like a soldier caught in civilian clothes but still carrying his weapon. "You will gather your things," Hauptmann Kleist instructed, his voice radiating cold authority. The train, now stopped, was surrounded by silence. Then Vance heard it, the sound of dogs barking in the distance and the rumble of vehicles approaching on a nearby access road. This was not an impromptu stop. This was a planned exfiltration. The other passengers, roused by the sudden stop, began to poke their heads into the corridor. A Stasi plainclothes man, the one from the dining car, was already there, waving them back. "A technical problem with the engine," he announced in German. "Please return to your seats. We will be moving shortly." Kleist and the two VOPO officers did not take Vance out through the public corridor. One officer produced a key and unlocked a small service panel in the side of the compartment, which opened into a maintenance passage. They guided Vance through it, away from any potential witnesses. He was not handcuffed. The diplomatic protocol was still being technically observed, but the VOPO on his left had a firm grip on his elbow. They emerged onto the gravel track bed beside the idling train. The night air was cold and damp. Two black Wartburg sedans were parked just beyond the tree line, their headlights cutting through the fog. Major Victor Orlov stood beside one of them, smoking. He had been waiting. Orlov looked not at Vance, but at Kleist. "Hauptmann?" Kleist held up the briefcase. "An empty, purpose-built compartment, Major." He was clean, but the case was not. Orlov nodded, a flicker of disappointment passing over his features. He had hoped for microfilm, for code books, for a complete victory. He had only a partial one, but it was enough. He turned his attention to Vance. "Herr Vance," Orlov said, in heavily accented but clear English. "A cold night for a train ride. My government will... I demand to speak to my embassy," Vance said. The words were automatic, the required response. "In time," Orlov said. "Your government is very far away right now. You are in the German Democratic Republic. You will be a guest of our security services. Please." He gestured to the open door of the sedan. Vance was placed in the back seat. The VOPO officers got in on either side. Kleist sat in the front with Orlov. The cars turned and drove away, leaving the Interzonenzug on the tracks. Minutes later, the train's main conductor, unaware of the drama, received clearance from the signal tower, now controlled by Orlov's team, to proceed. The D-240, one-passenger lighter, continued its journey to Berlin. Vance's exposure was total. He was not arrested, in the legal sense. He was detained. He had been removed from the board. As the car sped through the dark forest toward Potsdam, he thought of Fulcrum, waiting in West Berlin for a contact who would never arrive. He thought of his wife, Helen in Bonn, who would soon be told he was unavoidably delayed. The failure was absolute. The KGB and the Stasi had hunted him, isolated him on a moving piece of sovereign territory, and plucked him from it with terrifying bureaucratic precision. Arthur Vance was not taken to a prison. He was taken to a secure guest house on the outskirts of Potsdam, a requisitioned villa on the shore of the Griebnitz Sea, surrounded by a high wall and patrolled by armed guards. The Stasi reserved this location for special cases: high-level defectors, compromised diplomats, and political bargaining chips. The interrogation, when it began, was nothing like the high-drama scenarios Vance had trained for. There was no physical intimidation, no shouting, no bright lights. Instead, he was met with a debilitating, soul-crushing professionalism. He was placed in a comfortable, if Spartan, room. He was given clean clothes and food, but there was no clock. The windows were opaque. He was kept in sensory isolation for what he estimated was 2 days, long enough to disorient him, before Major Orlov entered the room, accompanied by a note-taker. "Arthur." "May I call you Arthur?" Orlov began, sitting across from him at a simple wooden table. He offered Vance a cigarette. Vance declined. "My name is Arthur Vance. I am an assistant cultural attaché at the United States Embassy in Bonn. I demand to speak to a representative of my government under the terms of the Vienna Convention." Orlov sighed, as if disappointed. "The Vienna Convention? Yes, we are all very respectful of it. That is why you are here, and not in a cell in Normannenstrasse. But the convention is for diplomats, Arthur. It is not for men who travel with tools." He placed the briefcase on the table between them. "So let us not speak of conventions. Let us speak as professionals." The interrogation was psychological. Orlov's goal was not a confession. He already had the evidence. His goal was cooperation. He wanted names. "This is a failure, Arthur," Orlov said calmly. "A failure for you, personally. Your career in the field is over. Langley does not tolerate failure. especially public failure. Vance remained silent. "We know about Fulcrum," Orloff said. Vance's blood ran cold. He had trained to resist this, but hearing the asset's code name spoken by the enemy was a profound shock. "He waited for you, you know," Orloff continued, lying seamlessly. "At the little cafe near the Savigny Platz. He waited for 3 hours. Our team watched him. He was disappointed. We, of course, followed him home." This was the leverage. Orloff was implying Fulcrum was captured. Vance's mind frantically tried to calculate. Was Orloff bluffing? Or had Fulcrum been compromised from the start? "We are not unreasonable men," Orloff said, leaning forward. "We have the briefcase. We have your testimony. Oh yes, the train conductors, the customs officers, they have all signed their reports. This is enough for a show trial. Diplomat attempts to destabilize the GDR. It would be very theatrical." Vance knew the threat was real. A show trial would be a massive propaganda victory for the East. Or, Orloff continued, "this can be a quiet administrative matter, a simple misunderstanding. It all depends on what you are willing to share with us. You are going to receive economic data, correct? We know this. We want to know what else Fulcrum has provided. What other networks are active in the economic ministry? Help us, and we can help you. You will be declared persona non grata and sent home. A quiet end." This was the classic KGB technique, offering the illusion of control, the reasonable way out, which was in itself the deepest betrayal. Vance was trapped. If he spoke, he would betray his country and his assets. If he remained silent, he risked a show trial that would embarrass his nation and likely sentence him to years in an East German prison, his diplomatic immunity stripped by a kangaroo court. He fell back on his training. "My name is Arthur Vance. I am an assistant cultural attaché." Orloff listened, then stubbed out his cigarette. "Very well. We have time." The interrogation continued for weeks. It was a war of attrition. Orloff would be replaced by Kleist, who was more bureaucratic, focusing on technical details. "The briefcase, Herr Vance." "Herr, where did you get it? From the technical services at Langley or the Berlin station? What is the name of the technician?" They deprived him of sleep, not by force, but by administrative necessity, waking him at odd hours for procedural questions. They fed him a bland, starchy diet. They gave him nothing to read. It was a system designed to unmake a personality, to break down resistance through sheer, monotonous gray pressure. Vance held on, but he could feel parts of himself, his sense of time, his confidence, his connection to the outside world, beginning to erode. The Interzonenzug D240 arrived at Bahnhof Zoo in West Berlin at 3:15 a.m., 3 hours behind schedule. The official reason given by the East German railway authorities was engine trouble near Brandenburg. For the CIA station in Berlin, operating out of the U.S. mission, the non-arrival of Arthur Vance was a disaster. Fulcrum, waiting anxiously in his West Berlin relative's apartment, received the abort signal at 4:00 a.m. He was terrified, but he followed his emergency protocol. He destroyed the microfilm he was carrying and, using a forged West German identity card provided for just such a contingency, he blended into the city, becoming a refugee in the system. The Berlin station exfiltrated him to the U.S. within 48 hours. It was the only positive outcome of the operation. In Bonn, Helen Vance received a visit from the station chief, a man she knew only as Mr. Harding, a friend of her husband's from the cultural department. His message was brief and cold. "Arthur has been detained in the East," he said. "It appears to be a dispute over his travel documents. We are handling it at the highest levels. It is imperative, Helen, that you say nothing to anyone. He has been delayed." The diplomatic aftermath was immediate and furious, but entirely invisible to the public. The U.S. ambassador in East Berlin lodged a formal protest, demanding the immediate release of Vance, citing the Vienna Convention. The Soviet ambassador in Washington was summoned to the State Department for an urgent discussion. The Soviets and East Germans, guided by Orloff's report, played their parts perfectly. They denied everything. There was no arrest. Herr Vance, they claimed, had voluntarily disembarked the train in Potsdam to assist GDR authorities with a customs inquiry. He was, they stated, currently a guest, while the matter of his espionage materials, the briefcase, was investigated. The CIA was in disarray. Vance had been a mid-level, non-critical officer, but his capture was a public, procedural humiliation. Langley convened a damage assessment team. How was he identified? Was Fulcrum a double agent? Was there a mole in the Bonn embassy? The Kestrel source was, for the moment, unsuspected. The blame fell on the aggressive, high-risk nature of the Stasi and KGB. For Vance, the aftermath was silent. His interrogation ended as abruptly as it began. One day, Orlov simply didn't appear. Vance was left in his isolation. The leverage had shifted. The US now knew Fulcrum was safe, so they had no need to bargain for him. The Soviets and East Germans knew they could not get a confession, and a show trial was risky. The US might retaliate by exposing a high-level Soviet diplomat in New York. Vance had become what he was in the beginning, a piece of currency. The political paranoia that had fueled his capture was now replaced by the cold, political calculation of his release. He sat and he waited, a ghost in the GDR's machine. Weeks turned into a month. Arthur Vance's detention in the Potsdam villa became his new, monotonous reality. Then, in early December 1971, the breakthrough came. The negotiations had been happening in the one place they always did, the back channels of Berlin. The US was willing to trade. The Stasi had a man, a mid-level HVA agent who had been caught by West German intelligence, the BND, while trying to recruit a secretary in the Bonn Defense Ministry. He was a small fish, but he was their fish. The exchange was quietly agreed upon. The legacy of the operation for its participants was stark. For Major Victor Orlov, the operation was a qualified success. He had not captured the microfilm, but he had captured a CIA officer, exposed the Fulcrum network, even if the asset escaped, and demonstrated the complete security dominance of the GDR's transit routes. He received a quiet commendation from his superiors in Moscow and a bonus. He continued his work, a patient spider in the center of the web. For Hauptmann Jürgen Kleist, the capture was a career-making moment. He had been the man on the ground. He had correctly identified the irregularity in the briefcase. His report was used as a training manual in the Stasi Academy, operational interception of a diplomatic target. He was promoted and transferred to a more senior position in Abteilung II, his future in the MFS secured. For Arthur Vance, the legacy was devastating. The exchange did not happen on the Glienicke Bridge. That was reserved for high-profile spies. His was a technical exchange, handled with bureaucratic anonymity. He was driven to the Friedrichstrasse station, the Tränenpalast, Palace of Tears, the crossing point for East and West Berlin. He walked through the steel and glass hall, past the GDR border guards, and into the arms of his Berlin station chief. He was pale, 20 pounds lighter, and emotionally numb. He was flown to Washington the next day. He was not met with a hero's welcome. He was met by the debriefing team. For 2 weeks, he was sequestered at a CIA facility in Virginia, going over every second of his ordeal. Why did you take the train? Why did you not check the briefcase? What did you tell Orlov? He was cleared of any wrongdoing, but he was now compromised. He had been seen by the KGB. His face was known. His name was burned. His field career was terminated. He was given a desk job at Langley, analyzing satellite imagery of East German rail yards. He would sit at that desk for the next 15 years, a professional ghost. His wife Helen stood by him, but the man who returned from Berlin was not the man who had left Bonn. The quiet, hidden part of him had been exposed to the light, and it had cost him everything. History, in the end, rendered its own verdict. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the systems that had defined the lives of these men collapsed with it. The Stasi archives were stormed. The files of Hauptmann Kleist, by then a colonel, were opened. His meticulous report on the detention of Akademiker was read by his former neighbors, an analytical, chilling testament to the banality of the state's power. He lost his pension and found work as a security guard for a supermarket. Major Orlov retired to Moscow before the collapse. He lived to see the end of the Soviet Union, which he regarded as a profound personal betrayal. He died in 1999, an old man in an unrecognizable country. His certitudes turned to dust. Arthur Vance retired from the CIA in 1988. He and Helen moved to a quiet home in Virginia. After the wall fell, he took one last trip to Berlin. He went to Bahnhof Friedrichstrasse. The Tränenpalast was now a museum. He stood in the hall where he had been exchanged, a place that had once been the absolute end of one world and the beginning of another, now just a tourist stop. The story of the D-240 train was not one of high-speed action or dramatic confrontation. It was a case study in the true nature of the Cold War. It was a war of grinding, bureaucratic patience, of signals intelligence, of low-level traitors, and of profound, crippling paranoia. The hunt was not a chase. It was a clinical, procedural act. The KGB and Stasi hadn't just caught a spy, they had processed him. They had used the rules of transit and the ambiguity of diplomatic law as weapons. Vance stood on the platform at Potsdam, watching a modern intercity express train glide silently toward Berlin. He reflected on the moral ambiguity of his own role. He had been working to free men like Fulcrum, but in doing so, had become a pawn in a game that had no winners, only survivors. The great ideological struggle, he thought, was ultimately waged by flawed, tired, and ambitious men in small gray rooms and on slow, dark trains, each a prisoner of the very system they sought to defend. For more historical explorations and deep analysis, we invite you to subscribe.